butcher it. It's fine.
I will try not to butcher your last name. I lived for 3 years in Hungary where every consonant and vowel combination is pronounced next to each other. And S is pronounced like sugar. So Russell Mitchell just drove them straight into hell. Eventually they caught my last name and went, oh, Michel, because they knew French people. Oh, so this is David Schmitz, who's going to talk to us this week about something cooler than Hutton. As always, the point isn't just to trash talk Hutton, but to help people who are new to the HEMA sabre scene find out what exists in manuscript and living lineages that might be interesting and fabulous, as opposed to, okay, I want to start, where do I go? David, take it away.
Quick few notes about me. I've been a martial artist before I've become a historical fencer. I've never bothered with anything else than the modern sources. So I am one of the few HEMAs who really don't know what people are talking about when longsword or other medieval or Renaissance stuff is coming up. So if we want to talk about like any technical stuff, the lingua franca for a lot of people is longsword terminology, and that is not going to work for me. So yeah, just as a heads up from that. My background is more in unarmed stuff, and then when I complained about not being able to learn anything with weapons in the very traditional self-defense jiu-jitsu class I was in, I gravitated towards historical fencing, and yeah, I got put into contact with Christmann, the source I'd like to talk with you today. I have a little bit of a presentation, but I think it would be good to have most of this like in a dialogue form or something. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen real.
Sounds great to us. We've all got a bevy of questions for you.
Hopefully. Okay, it should be working now. Yeah, I hope you can see the presentation.
Yep.
Can you give me a quick heads up? Okay. Yeah. So we're talking about theoretisch-praktische Anleitung des Hau- und Stoßfechtens by F.C. Christmann. It's a source that is that was written in 1838. Sorry. Yeah, I'd like to begin this with a quick shout out. This was a Cooler Than Hutton project, yeah, all the way back in 2012, when basically people skimmed through Hutton's work. So it's very relevant for the topic of the of this line. And Hutton himself basically talks about a lot of the offline fencing footwork that is interesting, but it's no longer done today. In Hutton's day, that is that today. And so Hutton himself alludes to it, but never describes it. And the look for the quest to find Christmann basically started when Markus Hampel, one of the people associated with making the source available for the HEMA scene in general, basically complained that, okay, Hutton tells us about all this cool stuff, but leaves it out. And Hutton himself also was kind of a HEMAist. I think that stands to reason to call him that. He was also interested in like anachronistic weapons for his time. But yeah, he just mentions like volta, offline movements, jumps, and this kind of stuff, and yeah, never had it in the source itself. Yeah, J. Christoph Amberger, I think some of you know him. He's a collector. He rediscovered the source basically and published some of the images out of it. And yeah, these images showed exactly this offline movement that made people interested in the source. And then a lot of people were involved with acquiring a copy that was not in Amberger's collection, transcribing it and providing the images. yeah, the relevant people I'm aware of, I put down in this quick shout out, and I put Ob in there because he wanted to be in this as well, and I'm nice like that. Yeah, and of course the people from my club, Mispeldown Aachen, where we reconstructed a lot of the fencing, and a lot of my knowledge or not knowledge of the source is basically coming from our shared practice. Yeah, exactly. I want to give a little bit of historical context. We know that context is everything, thanks to Matt Easton. Yeah, it was written in 1838 in Offenbach at the Rhine. This was after the Congress of Vienna, so we are in the post-Napoleonic time, but it was before the democratic movement of 1848, so it precedes a notion of a German nation. A lot of the modern framework is this German source, for example, failed to incorporate that reality that we can't really speak of Germany. There was a bunch of kingdoms. There's the Kingdom of Prussia, which is giant at this point after Napoleon got defeated. Yeah, but yeah, the city where the book was written was a part of the Grand Duchy of Hesse and was in close proximity of the Free City of Frankfurt and the Duchy of Nassau. I have a little bit of image, like a little bit of yeah, map material to show how yeah, how fragmented Germany at the time was. This is all of it. And this is basically the area that we're talking about here in the middle, with the Free City of Frankfurt in the middle in red. And you can see that it's kind of a mess around it. So yeah, we are in a time where the idea of a German nation is still more than 30 years into the future, with the Second German Empire under Prussian rule. Exactly. So the man himself talks to us why people should fence. I think this is kind of interesting from a HEMA standpoint. This is why I included this. This is in order, and this is the order that he chose himself. So he talks about the health and athletic benefits of fencing, that it's a game that you can just play for fun, that it's useful for instilling beauty in the body. But yeah, he shows to be a little bit a child of his time, because he says that for women it's fine to fence with both hands equally to become beautiful, but for men it is better to just fence with the dominant hand and yeah, just maximize the martial prowess. Rather than yeah, paying too much attention of cultivating a beautiful body. But from personal experience, as you get older, it's a good idea to fence with your left hand as well, because the asymmetry in the musculature can be really difficult for the body to deal with as you get older. Yeah, and fourth in his list is defending and fighting. We must note that Chrisman was basically trying to pimp out his source. He wanted to get people interested in this, so he casts a very broad net when he talks about this. But I think this could be one-to-one the list of like for HEMA itself as well. That we say, okay, it's not about the true martial whatever stuff, but there's a lot of things that you can get out of fencing. Without yeah, saying that this is meant to defend yourself, because it's not that likely that you're going to be in a saber fight nowadays. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Chrisman the man. He was born in Mainz at the Rhine, very close to where he published. He campaigned for Napoleon, was a member of the Guard. I have a little question mark there, because time-wise, this is a little bit difficult. So when he published in 1838 and Napoleon or the Congress of Vienna was in 1815, there's a lot of time there, and we can do this now, or we can wax poetic about this later. I think it's a little bit iffy. If he published in 1838, so 23 years after Napoleon was defeated, he must have been pretty young in order to be a soldier under Napoleon. So he must have get enlisted very early, or somehow tricked recruiters or something like that, for this whole story to make sense. He was an accomplished fencing master. He was a member of several German fencing academies and also of the French Academy of Boulogne. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Nice. I didn't butcher French. Yeah, he praised Franz Zellnitz as a bayonet source, and he says that he's not going to go into a lot of detail on bayonet because people should just read Franz Zellnitz. And he praised two of his students, an Oberleutnant and a Hauptmann, that he trained. So we know that he actively fenced himself. There are several mentions of him in newspaper articles and from public exhibitions. And we know that he trained soldiers himself in Mainz, Frankfurt, Offenbach, and Worms. But everything that we know about him is from the preamble to his work, which Pfeffinger, his publisher, wrote. So Chrisman himself doesn't self-aggrandize him a lot. This is something that his publisher does. So everything, or a lot of the stuff that we presume to know about Chrisman the man is stuff that basically we know from pro-Chrisman propaganda. But we know that one of his students, Müller, I think, wrote another HEMA treatise in Greek for the King of Greece, and also credited his training by Christmann for his fencing ability, at least partially. But rather interestingly, his source seems to be disconnected from Christmann in like the fencing principles. So he drops the name. He doesn't seem to be super like following the stuff that Chrisman outlines in his book himself. Yeah, that's it. What I wanted to talk about, the historical context. Are there any questions, or do you want me to go on to the technical stuff? Anything from you guys? Okay, just stop me from rambling if you have any questions. So Chrisman, the source, is at least two sources in a trench coat. So we have a battlefield fencing skirmishing part where the advice that he has in his dual fencing stuff is kind of a little bit thrown out of the window. He has some foil fencing in the book as well, but I would be very reluctant to call it a competent foil fencing source. He basically assumes, as a lot of people from the time do, that if you are actually interested in fencing in depth, you're probably an officer and you have already enjoyed your foil lessons growing up. And there's some funky stuff in there: defending against the bayonet, self-defense with a walking stick, defense against the lancier, and some stuff about cavalry sabre. But there's overlap between his the skirmishing stuff that he also does with baton, so with a large two-headed staff, and the cavalry sabre. According to himself, he wrote this book to be the first person ever to marry the distant cousins of cut and thrust fencing with each other again. We know that this is not the case. There have been books earlier than this who've also tried to bridge that gap that a lot of the sources did have prior to this, and also after Chrisman, there's still people who claim to be the first person to do this. It was a thing at the time that a lot of sources claim to do, to basically say, yeah, okay, we split fencing up into thrust fencing only, cut fencing only, and now I want to bring something to the table that tries to incorporate the two into a unified system again. It's fenced from the hanging guard. So if you look at the first of these pictures where the people are actually holding sabers, yeah, you can see that they are basically standing in hanging seconds. That's the guard that he wants people to assume, basically covering their head with the hilt of the saber, holding the blade outstretched in front of them. In the hanging guard, and yeah, basically trying to cover the head with the guard, the body with the blade, and slipping the leg if somebody attacks the legs, basically yeah, trying to have everything covered from the get-go. It's a very extensive source. It's a very dense source. So he covers a lot of actions, and a lot of his instructions. I don't have the things here digitally, but I have a copy next to me. A lot of his instruction is basically just yeah, different drills, how basically an agent should attack you and how a patient should defend against this. So he manages to convey a lot of fencing actions in a very limited time frame. Yeah, and I basically wrote out some of the less commonly found techniques that are in Christmann, because this was the reason why Christmann even came up. Like I said in the beginning, this was always supposed to be something cooler than Hutton, or something where the stuff that Hutton himself didn't include in his works was supposed to be found. So there's coupures in there, there's a lot of blade work in there, ramassements, there's a lot of contra parries, there's a lot of Waltz, a lot of detail that not necessarily all HEMA sources have, or I don't go so far that yeah, when it comes to later works, this is something that is extremely rare, that yeah, we get details in so many different kinds of techniques inside the same system and the same framework. It's very possible that I just don't know the source that you are working from, but yeah, as far as I know, this is something that is rather rare. Yeah, the other two images that I included here is basically his foil fencing, and there's a little bit of baton. I included this for Russ. He's a little savate and baton guy, and yeah, I hope that this entertains you. So he includes baton in moulinets as a wrist strengthening exercise. Yeah, so pretty complex, a lot of stuff is in there. Yeah, I'll try to cut through some of the instruction. Yeah, this is a very cool picture that I found in the book. Basically, that's the motto according to Christmann, that the art triumphs over strength. You can see a little tamed lion in the background, and a lot of the material that is used in the source is there. You can see you can see lances, you can see bayonets, you can see masks, so and gloves, and this appel sandal. So this is all fencing equipment, not martial stuff, but also a lot of the bladed weapons that fit into the period. Yeah, this is not a saber source, so a lot of the times people in HEMA are yeah, if we want to be charitable, they're very interested in a certain weapon. If we want to be uncharitable, they fetishize a certain shape of sword, and they want to do a weapon. And yeah, Chrisman is very explicit that this is not a saber source. This is a source that deals with several cut and thrust weapons, and the saber is one of them, but it can also be done with swords. It can also be done with epées and with palashes, so straighter swords. It can also be done with foils or sticks, so stuff that is only meant to thrust or only meant to cut. Yeah, you're supposed to leave out the techniques that don't work for your selected weapon, of course. Yeah, do you guys have any questions up to this part? Because I want to go into a little bit of an intermission and ask Francois which of these swords he has.
Let me check real
So-
quick. Well,
So we
I have this one.
see whose hand is raised while you're sharing the screen, David. But I would
Yeah.
wonder, to what extent would you describe Christman as teaching a system that is weapon agnostic versus a system to which a variety of weapons might be applicable?
That's a good question. So I think Christmann has incorporated or is trying to conceptually he tries to add cut fencing on top of a solid thrust fencing basis. So I think a lot of his stuff is less suited for the stick, at least if we look at the dual fencing where the majority of the source is working from. If you leave the thrusts out of it, a lot of the sensibilities of the system don't make a lot of sense. So, but I don't think that he pays a lot of attention to the weapon used itself. In his thrust work, you can definitely see that he tried to he assumes a curved sword. So you can see that in a lot of the thrust fencing where people assume a straight sword, basically the plane of the blade is very horizontal or very vertical, which is fine for a straight sword. But if we're talking like assume this is basically the saber and it's curved like this. It goes off target if you thrust completely horizontally. But if you assume a curved sword, it makes sense to choose diagonal thrusting angles that keep the point of a more curved sword on target. So I think he makes room for the curved sword, and he tries to put thrust fencing as the basis of a modern officer's education front and center. I hope that answers the question at least somewhat.
Does, thank you.
I find it
All
very
right.
interesting going off of this that you would say like, oh, this is a system meant for just whatever type of swords are all these, because and not just that, but it's cut fencing added onto a thrust fencing sort of ideatic background, because that's exactly what contrepoint is, and I think Chrisman calls his fencing contrepoint also, right?
Yeah,
So,
he does. So yeah, I think in your presentation you made the point with like pointe, contrepoint, and espadon, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is also a useful lens to observe Christmann through. I'm not well versed enough in French fencing to make any claims to how French this actually is. But the idea that you walk into Christmann already knowing thrust fencing, and you basically get working cut fencing add-on on top is very much in there. And I think a lot of the ideas that we have in Chrisman that we can talk about when I talk about the techniques a little bit later, it makes it obvious why you need thrust fencing background, or why it's very conducive for your fencing if you have it.
It is in some ways very French to have that. What I think is a difference is because you mentioned earlier that Chrisman seems to not put quite as much emphasis on the foil, whereas the French would have, I think, like I think 75 to 90% of their book would be foil, because that's the national weapon of the French. It's what
Yeah, and
they're known to be good at.
Chrisman basically says, okay, if you're a soldier, then there's the skirmishing system, which is very, very simple. It's basically mouliné à quatre faces. And then if you want to be a proficient fencer, then you're probably an officer, and then you already know thrust fencing. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overlook. And he basically just talks about, let me skip back a little bit, basically fencing actions that don't just make sense from the usual card and tiers way of fencing, but also from second and prime, the way he intends to fight with the hanging guard. So he has like very few, I can go into the source and look over this, but he has very few exchanges where it's basically about foil fencing itself. Christmann assumes you go into his work already a proficient thrust fencer. Or you're a trooper, and if you're a trooper, then it's just the skirmishing system for you, which is very, very, very bare bones, more like stuff you can drill with a lot of guys, and it has different sensibilities to it.
It sounds to me like de-emphasizing the foil in terms of the actual quantity of material in the book is maybe an adaptation to a German readership. No?
Possible. Yeah, I can't make an educated claim to this, but it sounds like this to me. Yeah. I think you actually own a few of these swords.
I counted 6, either historical examples or sparring swords I either bought or cobbled together.
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to point out here is that we, like in the image on the right, on the top, we basically see the briquet infantry saber, which is very cut heavy, very short. But is also put in there as a possible weapon to fence this system. And then I think it's the model 1830 very curved cavalry sword saber that we also see in the second from the bottom. So yeah, Christmann says a sword is a sword is a sword is a sword. You learn to fence, I give you a sword, and whatever you have internalized about fencing is going to come out. And I don't need to tell people that if you have a thrust-centric weapon to thrust more, and if it's a thrust-only weapon to forgo the cut, you learn to fence, and then we put a sword into your hands, and then you're going to manage. That's his idea.
How interestingly very much like French fencing, where they tell you that the specific sword in your hand doesn't matter as much as how it feels.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting too, especially I think because you touched on this a bit earlier, right? In the HEMA community, we tend to fetishize our swords, right? And so it's like, oh, what is the specific sword I need to do X or Y, right?
Yeah.
And here we have another system that comes in and says it's a sword or a mop handle, it doesn't matter. You're going to use different tools differently, but the overall way in which you're going to employ the tool is the same, and we're going to teach you that. And I think that's really interesting and a really great point that a lot of perhaps some of our HEMA people are missing, is that it doesn't matter what the sword is.
Yeah, and I don't want to spoil anybody's fun and say that it's bad that people are interested in a certain weapon. I think it's fine. It's a personal matter of choice. And I think in a way this is also a positive message for everybody who is, I don't know, interested in a very specific style of messer or a very specific style of saber and is struggling to find a source that matches this weapon specifically. Because at least some of the sources seem to be very sure about the fact that it doesn't matter that much, that if you have your favorite sword and you can't find the source that fits perfectly, just go out there and fence and learn fencing, and you will be able to use your desired weapon a lot better if you do some suboptimal source. rather than trying to sit around in the library, basically trying to find the one perfect source to practice, to be able to practice your favorite style of sword with. Because at the end of the day, it's a pointy stick. You can chop at people with it. You can poke people with it. Learn to fence.
What is the old saying? Don't let perfect become the enemy of good.
That's a very good point.
On the other hand, 85% of HEMAists would anyway like to distinguish themselves by their equipment and not their fencing. So a source that allows them to choose their own weapon might even go in hand with this.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we have to like it, right? Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the principles of defense according to Christmann. Like I already said, yeah, I would like to look at the fencer to the right here. Yeah, he wants people to do mostly small circles and actions that keep the point in line. If we think that this is something that is informed by a thrust fencing background, I'd be very keen to agree. Keeping the point in line basically always threatens the thrust. Yeah, it's kind of a good idea if you want to come back with a thrust proposed to not yeah, do stuff like the St. George's parry, the very big British one where you basically take the point offline completely to cover your head. I think it's called St. George. Yeah, I can't see you because I have the presentation maximized and I'm on one screen, but yeah, you guys know the one, right? A thrust riposte from there is going to be a lot smaller than if you do what we can see in the picture, where basically our opponent's body. He has two main parries, the hanging second and the hanging prime. He cautions people fencing from his principles that this is a rather exhausting way to stand on guard, and it is. It puts a lot of strain on the musculature holding the arm up, but yeah, it's also important that biomechanically there's a difference between just pulling your arm up and basically having a lot of the burden from the muscle, like putting a lot of the burden on the muscles that are pulling it up. And you can also just like rotate your shoulder joint downwards, and then the arm is held up in the structure by bones, which is a lot less taxing. But if you try to fence from hanging guard a lot, I think that it's a very good idea to drop your sword when people are not in measure to you anyway, and just raising it into your fighting position when there's actually a tangible threat. Yeah, I say they are his two main parries because he also does a lot of contra and upright parries. That's the fourth one. Basically, he stands in the hanging guard, and while the attack is coming, he basically goes from a hanging position to an upright position to displace the blade. A lot of his ramassements, so a lot of his blade actions also can be done defensively like that. So basically, while the attack is coming in, you're already turning into a tierce or a quart position to throw the opponent's blade away and then lunge in under their sword to attack them to the flank. Yeah, and in the beginning, he also slips a lot. So his idea is to keep the whole body covered and to only leave the legs open. And if somebody is attacking your leg, you're supposed to slip. So especially in the beginning of the book, or in the beginning of his instructions, he basically tells you to slip with every parry. Which is interesting, in my opinion, because if you slip with every parry, your riposte gets pretty slow. So it makes sense to look into the offense according to him. This is the same picture. This is not a mistake. I'd like you to look at the fencer on the left. So also his attacks are also small circle actions, and he's also trying to keep the point in line with his attacks. And he returns from the defensive slip that we have talked about before with a lot of feints or with moulinets. So his basic attacks are basically completely thrown from the wrist. I hope you can see this in the fencer to your on the left here. All he did is basically turn his wrist into the attack and lunge. So a lot of the attacks that Christmann intends for people to learn in the beginning are just cut from the wrist, exclusively from the wrist. We're talking about extended arm, no movement in the elbow, and it's all just in the wrist. Bigger attacks are thrown with moulinets, where basically the wrist is getting retracted and you put as much wrist motion as you can into the attack, but none of these with none of these attacks, you're supposed to leave your head exposed. So you're keeping the guard at like head level, and you don't move it out of the way for like any sweeping cuts, but you're keeping the guard and your fist, and with that the guard on your head level, because this is your primary defense against attacks to the head, and he doesn't want people to get cut in the head. It's a thrust-centric system. I think I hope I can make that point clear here. So these people, or the idea, his sensibilities are informed from thrust fencing. He tries to give you the opportunity to add cuts into your fencing toolbox without endangering you and without taking away from your thrust fencing abilities. And yeah, I have this this quote from Oliver, my coach, the head coach at Miss Bildon, and yeah, it's basically épée fencing with the saber. So yeah, you're keeping the point in line. You're trying to threaten the thrust, and the cuts are powered in a way that is not very impressive. If we're talking about like sheer force. But it's very small movements with basically skillful little attacks that are supposed to to not end the fight in the first blade contact, but to wound your enemy until you are so you have made enough headway into their body that they either give up or are no longer a threat to you, and while at the same time covering you and your body and your head as much as possible in the meantime. And this is something where I can kind of see like German sensibilities creeping into this. I'm not an expert on covered fencing, but this kind of sounds like covered fencing to me. Exactly. So Chrisman was a German, so we have a source with extreme level of details. I have given you the cutting diagram of Chrisman here to the left, and you can see that there's a lot of lines on that dude. Way more than you can see in than you would see in like British systems who get by with 6 cuts. This seems like it's too much, and in my opinion, it's too much. Like nobody needs to know this excruciating level of detail in their attacks. But he's not making stuff up. So you can see, for example, here these lines that go into the shoulder and into the chest. those are the only downward attacks that he has, aside from the stuff that's directly going towards the head. And he talks about that it's important to have cuts that follow the bend of the ribs. So yeah, a lot of the rising cuts that he has are basically in there to not hack into the torso of your opponent, but to follow the line of the ribs, to cut as deeply as possible with as little resistance as possible, which kind of makes sense if you don't have like big chopping motion a lot of other saber sources have. You basically have to pick and choose your targets. Yeah, and also what I wanted to note is that this attack here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's marked as Y. This is basically the diagonal cut into the hips or gut. And we only have this on the inside. And he also talks about this in his source, that it doesn't make sense to strike this cut from the outside because the hip bone of your opponent is in the way and you're not going to deliver an effective attack that way. So yeah, the attack that is called Z would start from the left side and follow along this line. As you can see with all the other horizontal cuts, there's basically Q and R. That this is starts from the inside and goes to the outside. This starts from the outside and goes to the inside, and we don't have it here because he doesn't want people to just cut into the hip bone and not getting a lot of work done with his with the attack. So yeah, for me, it's still, especially because I've also looked into other sources, it's still a little bit ridiculous to have this extreme level of detail. But yeah, dude's a German. Germans like to over-engineer stuff, so he over-engineered stuff. Maybe something of note is in this cutting diagram, you see cuts that have solid lines and cuts that have these dotted lines. The solid lines are his main attacks that you are able to throw without taking your hand off of the head level, so that you can, like these attacks, you are able to cut completely covered. And the ones with the dotted lines are the ones where you basically have to adjust your hand and the guard, and you're basically not covered when you're attacking in any of these on any of these dotted lines. So yeah, also something that Chrisman has thought about. Yeah, before I get into the fancy stuff, any questions about his teachings in general, like how to attack, how to defend, anything that like struck you as peculiar in there?
I want to, if you could go back to the previous slide real quick. It's not really a question, but I really like, yeah, when I first saw this, I was like, this is way too much. But when, especially the part where you distinguish between the dotted lines and the solid lines, and you can cut to these areas without uncovering your head, that's really cool. Absolutely fantastic.
He seems to have thought about this. So basically, it's hard to read this, I know, but the first attack is basically from the second, and it goes along this line. This is A. And then it goes around. So you have that's the second cut, then you have the flank is B, then you have tiers, you have prime to the head from the top, you have quart, then you have the one to the chest. Demi-cirque is G, and H is basically one where you have the full cirque, where you basically turn your arm around completely and deliver an upwards cut, which is super, super hard to do. But Chrisman himself says, yeah, okay, you're not supposed, or it's unlikely that you're going to be able to deliver this kind of cuts that rises up completely. But it's a useful exercise for the nimbleness of your wrist. And yeah, all of these 8 main attacks he shows people are the ones that you can use from here. And it's just like this. It's all just different rotations of the wrist, which is interesting.
I also like the fact that we're also pointing out, right, we don't have to have that huge, super over the top fight ending blow every time, right? Especially like look at the arms here, right? We're just, I'm gonna attack near target. And I love the fact that he's enumerated all of these cuts to our near target that's holding the sword, because the thing holding the sword is also a really valid target. I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and we have a lot of debate about this whole, attacks to the arm are not martial enough, stuff like that. Chrisman seems to have been very interested in cuts to the hand. So he has the whole thing enumerated from the outside and from the inside, and gives you different angles to attack to the hand. And this is also something that Russ, with his Hungarian background, is also probably gonna like. A lot of these cuts to the inside here, like I said, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but those are usually ones where you dip under the blade and go with the false edge. And you basically just try to snap to the head as quickly as possible, to the hand as quickly as possible. And yeah.
To head off the naysayers real quick for that say that the hand is not a valid target, right? Notice again in this diagram, the hand is not a target, probably because it's going to be behind a saber guard. But as soon as that wrist comes into play, all of that stuff is really tasty looking.
One thing I'd like to add from the French perspective, they really like to thrust at the forearm, the hands, and whatnot, because one of the things that happens, especially with sharps, when you thrust here, it goes through, and then it gives you a lot of control over what's going on with that after you've got your blade in there. So stop thrusts to the arm are a thing that the French like to do a lot when the opportunity presents itself. I find it interesting that you see something similar with the cuts here.
And we can also look at the thrust targets. Like I said, this thing is a little bit hard to read, but I can guide you through it. So basically you can see one of the thrust targets is this little circle right next to the shoulder. This is also something that could be a stop thrust. Then we have the lower target down here, right above the belt line. And we also have one here basically in the armpit. And the one to the chest right here next to the arm, and the one underneath the armpit, both of them, if you thrust into this, people are gonna cancel out of their attack against you pretty likely. Especially if you're fencing from a hanging guard and the attack is gonna come down from the top. Then it basically is gonna fall on your sword, right? If you thrust with the hanging guard, the stop thrust is pretty effective from here. So I agree with the Chrisman haters. This is an absurd level of detail, but I also have to give credit where it's due. This is not some dude who just tries to come up with the most ridiculous attacks possible. There is merit to this. That's all I want to say. And something that we probably not going to get into because it's super Christmann specific, but you also see like two very curved attacks here, which are basically his close to his coup de maître, where you're basically trying to have good edge alignment on a curved path. And I think anybody who ever into a target with a sharp knows that something as curved as like this line or as this line, performing this with good edge alignment is going to be difficult. This is basically called Schleuderterz and Schleuderquart, so something like thrown tiers or thrown quart. That's an interesting style of attacking, but very hard to do. But like I said before, Christmann spoils us with detail and gives us seemingly, or from my point of view, what looks like a good attack, a good expert level attack. And it's hard. It's going to be hard to incorporate this into fencing. It's going to be hard to actually stand in front of a clay target or something, throw something like this and actually cut into it. But at least Christmann seems to be convinced that this is a useful attack to learn when you strive for excellence in saber fencing. And I think this is, even if I accept all the gripes that I have with Christmann, and we can talk about like my critique of this as somebody who has practiced it for a long time as well, after I'm done with the presentation. What Christmann really allows us to do is look at a period source that is from the latter or the later periods where the pedagogy is already pretty good, but also doesn't skimp out on the details like sadly a lot of the saber sources do. They are just meant to get troopers battle ready as quickly as possible. And yeah, Christmann basically has the officer fencing, the dual fencing stuff that's very technical, very small cuts in the beginning, and has a segment for, yeah, okay, now you're an officer that can fence well. This is the stuff that I want you to teach to troopers. And it's both in the source. And so we get to look into a lot of the more complicated fencing actions in a modern framework that is easier to understand, especially if you have a background in Olympic fencing, for example, because this is not too far off from that. Yeah, and speaking of this, I would like to talk a little bit about his like the juicy stuff, the stuff that motivated the people to be interested in Christmann, and that's basically
I think
his.
you're missing two questions here, though.
Good.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I don't have to. Okay, yeah, hit me.
I had just a little question. Does he really expect you to attack the foot, like or?
Yeah, so yeah, that's an excellent question, because it also goes back to why do we defend like Chrisman wants us to defend. So he says that attacking the foot is a bad idea, and attacking the foot against somebody who's in a hanging guard is even worse of an idea. And I think there's real merit to that. So if you think about facing somebody with an upright guard, fainting high and then going low is something that I can see working out, and I have also fenced this way, and yeah, it works. But somebody who's fighting from a high guard and also a upright high guard as well, but a hanging guard, I think even more. If you try to feint high, people don't move their swords a lot because it's already up there, right? And well, I get a guess. And if you're, yeah, and then if you're going low, then people are just gonna slip their legs, just like we can see in this picture, and they're just gonna turn the sword. They're just gonna turn the sword around and let it drop on your head while you're trying to go to a leg that's very easy to retract.
Oh, so basically he expects to know how to defend, but not actually advised to do it.
Yeah, and he also deals a lot with like people who don't follow his, not a lot, but he talks about people who fight from an upright guard, and he says that it might be a better idea to go for the leg if you have somebody who fights with like the normal stuff, the normal tiers and quart guard. But he makes sure that the readers of his books know that a leg attack is dangerous. He says this is not an initial attack. You have to set this up. You have to feint, or you have to find some other crafty way to create an opening to go for the leg. And this is something that is quite dangerous, which is something I'd co-sign that.
Yeah, okay. The Schleuder stuff we get to later, right?
Yeah, if you want to get into that, we can go into that later. But
okay, yeah. If you go into it later, it's okay. Elsa had a question, but then it's okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna look this up in the source real quick so I can basically tune to the right page. Iso, you had a question as well?
I think Isabel had a question, right?
Yeah. Are there any other sources you know of that also have the extreme level of detail in the cut diagram?
Oh, just in the cut diagram?
Yeah, the thing with the many cuts.
Not to that degree. Not to that degree. Like the Italian stuff that I've looked at is way more general in this description. For example, they have stuff like spalla if it goes for the shoulder, or bandoliere if it goes like across the body, and they have I think it's called figura when it goes to the face. They have alla testa if it goes to the head, but something that has this like this distinct, okay, this is a horizontal cut that goes along this line, this is a rising cut that tries to hit into the spaces between the ribs. I have not seen this before, but I'm also not that much of a scholar. So other people, maybe people who watch this recording, can point out if we have sources that go into that level of detail.
Okay, cool. And I had another question, because Germany and France have always been a bit of a problem. So how do you see that this French influence, as Francois keeps pointing out, hey, this looks French? How does that work with the social dislike between the two countries?
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to skip a little bit backwards. I don't know, like just to bring everybody up to speed, I think most of you probably gonna know this, but you can see that the Rhine area here to the left is colored in the same blue as the Kingdom of Prussia, because this is actually the part of Germany that was conquered by Napoleon and was French for a while. And I live in that area, so I can also say that we have a lot of French loanwords from that time. So there was animosity towards France at that time for sure. But I think it's also obvious that Chrisman didn't try to hide the fact that he was fighting under Napoleon, which he probably also did to some capacity. So it doesn't seem to be the case that people were mad about it necessarily, but there was a level of respect that the people at the time afforded to Napoleon for his conquests. That's how I try to make sense of the whole thing. But yeah, there are probably people who are more like out of patriotism. Prussia enjoyed a very big or Prussia had a lot of friends across Germany for basically freeing the Rhineland from French occupation. So people probably weren't thrilled with the French, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be the case that this, like having served under Napoleon, was something that you try to hide from other people. But it seemed to be something where you can get respect for, yeah, for fighting under him, which is interesting. And yeah, maybe some historian can enlighten me on more of that. But yeah, that's my amateur answer.
Cool.
Yeah, any more questions before we go on to the fancy stuff? Doesn't seem to be the case. All right. So yeah, like I said, the source was discovered because people wanted to do the cool shit that Hutton alluded to, but didn't get around. And I think in his works he also said, yeah, it's not that useful and it's not being done anymore, so it's not that important to know about. But Christman thought it necessary to talk about these attacks. So yeah, first of all, we have the allongé. So this is his way of performing a stop thrust. We can see here, it's like a dancing diagram. I hope you can see that there's a little footprint basically here in the back. And yeah, you're supposed to do a slip, but you're doing a slip forward. Yeah, you keep the point in line always in his system. So basically just tipping your wrist a little bit and yeah, moving forward while your opponent is also moving forward. You perform this parade allongé or allongé, probably allongé. He also calls it the French vault, and he also called it the naval vault. So marine vault is the term that he uses. And he says that it's a very effective technique, but that you basically need to be pretty ballsy to try something like this. Yeah, then here's the Spanish vault, de España, where you perform the slip like you're supposed to in his system anyway, and you basically deliver a thrust to your opponent over the attack. This is also an opportunity he takes to caution us to overly rely on the Nebenhiebe, so the attacks where you lower your fist. Like you can see the fencer with the number 3 here, he's no longer covering his head and basically opens himself up for that level of attack. Yeah, and in this section, he also says, yeah, from now on, whenever somebody is trying to attack you in any of the low lines, you can slip the leg and just thrust over, because the slip is gonna remove especially the lower part of your body, and then you're just gonna lean forward. Yeah, and it's just risky to do this with somebody who goes for like the chest or the head targets, but somebody who tries to strike into like abdomen or lower, you're just going to be just out of reach for them, and their torso is going to be right there for the taking. So just do the Spanish vault. I don't know why he calls this the Spanish vault. Maybe this is something that is related to Destreza. I'm not well versed enough in Spanish fencing to make heads or tails of this. But yeah, I think it's funny that he calls this the Spanish vault.
It looks a lot like a double extraño, where you're standing as you would, and then you bring the front foot back and then the back foot back to take a back step.
Yeah, basically. It's like that. It's a little bit like that, for sure. Yeah, and those two are, I think, pretty straightforward. I would not be surprised to see something like this, which is very straightforward in other sources as well. But Chrisman also blesses us with stuff like this, where we get pretty crazy movements. So yeah, you can see in the top left, it's a diagonal lunge. So basically, he lunges diagonally forward with the back foot to attack your opponent on the outside line, while basically taking your body out of harm's way to their outside. Then we have the half vault, which is a little bit like an inquadrata from thrust fencing. Here you can also see the shadows where the feet used to be, and where you basically turn to the inside line while taking your body away. This is still a simple turn, and then we get the full vault, where you basically jump forward and attack your opponent on the outside line, on the inside line, sorry. And then you have something like this. This is a more complicated name, but yeah, I called it the Waltz, because the footwork is kind of like the dance move in waltz dancing. And he also has a real waltz later, but that's in his in the skirmishing portion, where you basically draw also large cuts above your head to basically cover yourself against multiple opponents attacking you from multiple sides. But the footwork is kind of similar, so I called this waltz in quotation marks. And yeah, like I said, I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty certain that something like this level of detail, this level of offline footwork is something that we don't usually see in the latter sources, where we basically get insane foot diagrams that can put like dance moves to shame. Exactly. So anything you'd like to know about the Waltz part?
Why would one opt to go all the way past your opponent with a Waltz instead of just doing the half?
That's an excellent question. So in the section later, in the skirmishing section, the reason to do moves like this is to cover yourself while attacking your opponent. So basically, with these turns, you're covering yourself against attackers from other directions as well. I really don't know why anybody would do this except for like styling on people. I don't know. I don't know.
Look like styling.
Having played Lacan, I can tell you that sometimes that styling can actually be very practical. If you have someone who lunges over aggressively and becomes ballistic, if you can control your distancing and make those covers and steps while they're in, I'm explosive, which is great, but I can't turn around meanwhile, it actually can be shockingly practical. It doesn't look shockingly practical, but it can be very, very useful. Plus, you get the advantage of smacking somebody in the back, which is
yeah, maybe this is a good idea or a good reason to fence like this.
I've seen this in BLS in 1862. In the saber lessons of Mr. BLS, he has things actually where you're going, essentially doing similar movements to the left and right. So it took me a bit to figure out where I saw this. He doesn't have all these useful diagrams for it. It's just a text. But I think that's the only place I've ever seen it in French works. But
that's very cool. That's exactly what I had hoped out of this I had hoped that we get out of this conversation, that we basically, because this can't be as singular as it seems to me.
I'll send you a copy.
Doesn't seem to be something that Chrisman has come up with on his own. Yeah, but it's kind of it might not be a unique selling point for Chrisman, but it's a selling point in my opinion, that we get to tell rapier fences that we also have a lot of fun offline movement and in-tempo actions in the latter sources, and that you can also do this with the saber.
Marcus, I think you had one.
I can say that I have done the waltzer turn in longsword on someone who was not prepared for it, and it worked. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so too. It's probably also something that if you find yourself in a duel, then if you do this to somebody, then they are probably going to concede. So you don't even need to strike them. If you dance around them while they are just trying to get a simple attack in.
You've just won.
Yeah.
You just won with style.
Yeah. The crowd is just going to go, oh my God, he didn't just. And then, yeah, the other person has to resign in shame.
Cry in shame.
I also wanted to point out some other stuff. Like I said, it's basically multiple sources in a trench coat, and this is also some stuff that Chrisman illustrated for us. So we have this attack, this defense against the lancier, which I still think is pretty dangerous. I don't know how he managed to get a hold of the lance. but yeah, you can also see the recommended footwork, where basically it's also like a vault out of the charging horse's path. Yeah, basically a large circular motion with the front leg, and yeah, doing a massive slip to get to the inside of the lancier. Insane to attack a person on horseback with a lance, with your saber, but yeah, if you ever wanted to know how you're supposed to do this or what your best chances are, then there you go. Yeah, like I said, there's also self-defense with the cane. You can also see some techniques he recommends against ruffians. In the lower part, we have his cavalry fencing or Molinear quatre faces ideas. He says that a lot of this can also be done from horseback, and recommends basically people practicing their moulinets like that. So in like with the legs spread apart, like you were standing in stirrups, and yeah, it's also something that you are supposed to do from horseback. And as far as I know, this is also something that's super common in French fencing sources all over the place, to basically have moulinets that attack your front right, your front left, to the back to your right, and to your back to your left, and to basically have 4 walls you can put up. Yeah, and this one is a nice depiction. It's one of my favorite depictions in the book, of a cavalryman trying to hold his own against an infantryman with a bayonet, because his horse actually is taking a nap. The horse sleeping. Is fine. It's just sleeping. Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the other part of Christmann, especially like this trooper system, the one that is meant for skirmishing. Like I said, it's basically moulinets to 4 different directions of view. It's made for the battlefield. He's pretty adamant about it. That this is something that you should be doing if you're in large skirmishes. It doesn't have any of his thrusting game in it. You can apparently do it from horseback or on foot. I have not ridden a horse, so I can't make any claims to the validity of the claim, but I don't see why not. And we also did some Italian stuff from horseback, and it was kind of similar. It's large moulinets. It's also from the wrist, so it's not like the Italians would do it with like elbow only or shoulder and elbow attacks. It's basically taking the line and drawing a large circle in the air with the point of your saber, and it tries to attack and cover at the same time, and also tries to cover your friends at the same time. So if you do a moulinet, you have a very good chance to deflect any attack coming in from that angle. And it doesn't matter if it's directed at you or the person standing next to you. Yeah, having fenced in 14 versus 14 saber skirmishes, I can assure you that everybody's doing moulinets all the time. So nobody is going for weird, like little cuts or for a lot of thrusting. So the name of the game is yeah, throwing large moulinet attacks, and yeah, trying to not get killed by basically taking turns with the people around you. So when you attack, they are basically not attacking to throw out your moulinet while you're retreating, and then it's a lot of rhythm seems to be at play here. Yeah, and he does this with the saber and also with the baton. So yeah, you can also do this with a 2-handed stick. We have tried to fence with this, but yeah, the baton is like a 1.5 meter ash stick, and if you get just a wrist moulinet of that thing against the head, then you are not going to be happy. So yeah, it's not something that you get to fence with intention a lot, in my opinion. All right. Yeah, the big question, and this is taken straight off the out of the Discord, right? The question is, Chrisman, all right, he calls his stuff counterpoint, but it's written in German. Is this a French or a German source? With the stuff that I work with, the historical context, a German source is already kind of a difficult claim to make. There was no German nation at that point. But yeah, there were basically different kingdoms that spoke German languages. So we know that Chrisman was taught French fencing. We know that he held a degree in a French fencing academy. All of his terminology is in French. So there's a lot of, like I said, when I talked about the different actions that he has covered, those are all taken straight out of the book. So he always goes with a German variant, but he always says, okay, this is a prime coupé, this is an attack forcé. So he always includes the French word for the fencing action alongside his German translation. Yeah, he tried to write a manual to train soldiers in the fragmented kingdoms that are modern Germany, and he tried to cater to what his target audience considered proper fencing. So I think a lot of his ideas of covering yourself in this hanging guard and stuff like that, it doesn't seem particularly French to me, but I think this is something where we can maybe see some similarities to the German fencing sensibility of the time. So I would say it's a mix of French and German. And yeah, if you put a gun to my head and don't allow me to say both, I would call it French, made palatable to a German audience. I think a lot of the baseline assumptions with the thrust fencing focus and stuff like that is so distinctively French that basically the German spice thrown into this is not enough to make this distinctively German or Germanic or yeah, anything of that sort. Yeah, and if we accept that Christmann is somewhat of a French source, he tries to bridge the gap between cut and thrust fencing. Like I said, he claims to be the first person to ever conceive of the brilliant idea to include cut fencing and thrust fencing, or thrust fencing and cut fencing, which is bullshit. But yeah, if we at least view Christmann as French fencing adjacent, then what he tries to do is to find a middle ground between Pointe and Espadon, like Francois explained to us in the three videos ago. Yeah, so this smells like contrepoint, and that's what he calls his stuff. So yeah, that's my not so expert opinion on this. Yeah, lastly, if you want to do some further reading, I provided the link to the source there. That's the stuff that got published in 2012 by the people at Fechtsaal, where we get the free transcription of the source. It's in German though. Then there's also, if you're interested in counterpoint sources, there's also Talhofer Isnadi. It's also written in 1838, and it has a creepily similar name to the book from Chrisman and Pfeffinger. So close that we actually thought that this might be the same publication, and that one basically copied the work of the other person. but I think with Talofa Isnadi, you see, like, even just comparing the images, you can see that he seems to be a little bit more French. Like, he seems to be more like with the extended arm and the upright parry. Maybe this is more counterpoint than Chrisman can ever hope to be. Yeah, but as far as I know, not a lot of people are looking into Talofa Isnadi right now. But yeah, if you think, okay, I want to see some French influenced stuff, I want to translate something from German, or this is, I think, an Austrian source. Yeah, this is something that might be interesting to contrast with French fencing of the period in general and with Christmann specifically. And I can also make the announcement that our Christmann publication is coming up. It's basically already done. It's going to be, for now, it's just going to be the basics. But for somebody who's interested in just looking into basically attacks, parries, feints, stuff like that, yeah, it's already going to be something people can work off of. Yeah, Oliver insists that it's going to be test printed first, and we're going to take a look at it and an example, and yeah, from that it's off to the races. So this translation work, basically making this source available for the English-speaking world, it's coming up, but yeah, translating this source, because it's so extensive and because it's so dense, is kind of difficult. But yeah, people like to ask me, Christmann translation when? And the answer finally is now. So 3 cheers to that.
I feel targeted.
Yeah, all right. If you're interested in looking further into that stuff, there's basically Oliver, my coach's YouTube channel. He's also on ePubli and Lulu and has some books on there. I think the English translation is going to go on like the self-printing service Lulu, because ePubli is not available everywhere as far as I know. Yeah, we are on Facebook at Mispeldoorn Aachen, and there's my Thingiverse account where I publish saber grips for your sabers to 3D print. Any more questions? Oh yeah, and learn foil.
Slideshow. Oh yes. Let's break out of slideshow so we can see who's got their hands raised.
Yeah. All right. That's all I got.
Bonsoir.
Hello.
Yes. One of the things that I noticed, well, one was fairly obvious while you were showing us some Chrisman, is that he's often seeking the engagement second, which is very different to me, because in French we seek the engagement in CS, because that will cover essentially the whole body, but we want to stay hidden behind our guard. Same thing in cap, you only turn the wrist here. In second, though, I'm noticing that you keep the hilt fairly high, which covers the head, but doesn't that leave the bottom of the body a bit more open? Do you think that's something that's done to cover German fencing culture's sensibilities?
Yeah. So I don't know if it was me or if you kind of cut out, but like to summarize the question is, like in French fencing is usually, let me turn a little bit, that you have your sword kind of outstretched to cover, like to keep your opponent at bay, and that a hanging second basically seizes that advantage, right? Essentially,
in French we like to have, well, arm extended, yes, to be hanging out in TS or cap if the engagement changes, but usually we like to stay in TS. And one of the things that does is when we're in profile like this, you see how the guard kind of covers my whole body here, and you kind of necessarily you're going to have to break me out of that. One of the things I'm noticing in second, like Chrisman likes to show, he's like this. So, well,
yeah, but
imagine they hold a bit higher. Yeah.
you have your point too far retracted, so it's outstretched. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah, it
something,
basically, yeah, it's a similar idea.
Yeah.
It's a similar idea, and you are weakening the cover of the guard as you go down. And Chrisman is aware of it, and he basically tells you that it's not a big deal because what you're doing is you're reinforcing a very vulnerable target, the head, and you're giving up coverage at the bottom of your body. And if people want to attack there, they are invited to, because then he's going to just burst out the Spanish vault and try to stick them while retracting the bottom of the body. But yeah, I think there's a lot of fencing guards that you can assume that makes sense.
And that's an adaptation that you see done very often with Contrapoint. It gets essentially imported elsewhere. For now, I see it in Chrisman. I've seen it on other, I think, German sources. I think Hermann also likes a second engagement. In Britain, Waite does it. Do you think that's something that essentially gets done to cater to the sensibilities of the local fencing culture?
Yeah, that's basically what I would put this towards. I think this is the idea of this. Like, if there is something as German fencing at that time, I think there is a case to be made that covering yourself, being defensive in your approach, is something that the German fencing community at the time seems to have been interested in. And if you look at the Italians, for example, they kind of don't give a shit. They work with invitations a lot. They say, yeah, okay, I'm going to open myself up here, but I know that I'm open in that way. And I think the French are more covered than the Italians, probably, and the Germans are just basically trying to be completely safe in their en garde position. Russ?
Actually, Georgia was ahead of me. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Ladies first, I guess. Anyway, I think that the question pertaining as to whether the thing with having high second as a standard engaging guard, I think it does actually have quite a bit to do with German sensibilities. Where, for example, if you look at most covered cut fencing schools like Kreuzler or Berlin Sabre, they have Berlin Sabre not, but Kreuzler specifically does have the guard at head level, and it combines this whole leaning aspect of putting your chest forward and your legs back. So you really, the lower targets, if you're going for somebody who's leaning forward, you're shortening your reach to that point that it is almost comical. So they really have the mindset of being completely covered. And Chrisman looks at, to me at least, from that perspective, as a very, how should I say, it's middle ground approach, where yes, your engaging guard isn't as, retracted in the lower part of your body and so much lean forward in your torso and the like. So pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I'm not aware of the Berlin stuff a lot, but I've talked with Tobias Zimmermann a little bit about the Kreuzler-Ruth side of things, and with them, it's really daunting to fight against them in my experience. So because they lean forward so much and they fence from a high tiers, I think primarily, and the guard covers their head, and the only targets you really have is their hand, but their hand is also behind the guard. The head is behind the guard as well, because it's so stretched out, and everything, body or legs, is removed so much. It's really difficult to see an opening just from their en garde position. It's like facing a tank head on. Everything is covered, and you basically have to get creative to create openings. There is no opening inside the stance or the en garde position itself, but it's standing like this is even more strenuous than Chrisman. I've tried it, And it's also very difficult to take backward steps in that style of standing, because they are leaning forward so much. They basically only have the option to work forward, or they have to basically rebalance themselves to take backward steps. So yeah, I think it doesn't make sense to have a discussion of what is the perfect guard. I think there's just drawbacks to any of them.
No, not at
but
all.
I think the stuff that Chrisman put into his source, definitely, or from my perspective, it definitely tries to cater to German sensibilities of like covered fencing.
Yeah, correct. I'd
agree with you.
Saying that, oh yeah, this is the one way to do it. It's just interesting that there's a certain parallel. But yeah, that was all on my side. So yeah, thanks.
So I'm going to be a contrarian for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think Chrisman might be able to make legitimate play to saying, I'm going to be the first guy to mix cover and cut fencing with counterpoint. But what I see is not specifically a German sensibility, but a Central European one. For example, if we look at Domian, which is not hugely available, we see a lot of this. You look at Chapon, you see a lot of this, also big counterpoint influence, to the point where the Hungarians typically refer to wrist-centric moulinet fencing as French, as a quick shorthand, because the influence is obvious. That happens when you've had to deal with Napoleon twice. People very much respect the military organization. I think we have something going on in the early 19th century that is different from the late 19th century, where you do see a lot more heavily single-weighted stances, a lot more shortening of one side of the torso and lengthening on the other, and a real preference for high hanging guards that tends to diminish later on in time. And I think it's sort of an exciting thing that we're getting these all in translation, so the international community can get past the linguistic barriers and start really making meaningful comparisons with this. I think in 5 or 6 years, we're going to see a lot more commonalities than differences for the manuals published from the 1819 to 1846-ish era. And thanks for continuing my TED Talk.
Yeah, I think I'm also very hopeful that we can get the hanging guard stuff out there a little bit more, and I'd be very happy to see people trying these hanging guards a little bit in tournaments, for example, because the default there, as far as I know and as far as I can see, seems to be the upright guards, and I'm not sure if this is because it's easier to fence from them, or if this is actually out of some like hidden superiority. The sources themselves, they show both. They show that some fencing masters seem to really like the hanging guards. Some seem to really like the upright guards, and I think there's also, I don't have it right here, but basically there was I think a British source that cautioned people against overusing hanging guards because it's so much more draining on the body.
The one we all like. Guess which one?
So yeah, it's I'd be happy if we can get like the word about the hanging guard stuff out there, and I think it would be interesting even to have matchups between hanging guard versus hanging guard versus upright guard, and upright guard versus upright guard, and see where this whole thing goes. I think that if we were interested in basically forcing diversity on HEMA Sabre, which seems to somewhat be what we want to do, we might think about like having tournaments where you have to fence like in all 3 configurations or in all 4 configurations: hanging versus hanging, hanging versus upright the one way, upright versus hanging the other way around, and then upright versus upright. Would be something that I would find super interesting, because I can see how like all of these games change. Markus?
So I have a few technical questions, because I already read the book while I didn't really practice this because it was more like a curiosity to me. I have a few, there's just some stuff which kind of confused me, where I was like, okay, I don't understand this stuff. But maybe you have some quick answers for you. For example, what's the difference between a regular feint and a Täuschfinte? I don't know if you can really translate this on the fly.
So Christmann has a tendency to be overly complicated. So, and he has distinctions that don't translate into, in my opinion, don't translate into other people's sensibilities. So you have to know the Chrisman stuff to, like he, for example, differentiates between firm feints and flowy feints, flüchtige Finten. I don't think that anybody else really gives a shit, but Chrisman is really, really adamant of into like drilling this into his pupils, that there's a difference between basically going like this for your feint and going like that for your attack, and to go like this in a fluid motion. The first he would describe as a firm feint, and the latter he would describe as like a flowy feint. And the Täuschfinden part is, it's not exactly this, but it's like that. He has like different concepts to differentiate techniques that are not necessarily split up like that in other fencing systems. Yeah, I can look into the Täuschfinden part, but yeah, he also spends a lot of time on double feints, right? He says double feints are not a good idea. You shouldn't do that. Oh, by the way, this is how you do them. It's good to practice double feints to get good at single feints. So yeah, practice double feints, but don't use them in earnest.
I think this is also then so I think the Schlenkerhiebe have something to do with the feints as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. The Schlenkerhiebe are basically the aggressive way to do these flowy feints. So it's an attack that follows a curved path to try to put a feint and an attack into the same movement. So it's basically made to cut around, especially people in upright guards. So if you're standing in one of the upright guards, the attack is starting low and encourages you to drop your sword down to catch it, but it's basically traveling from down to get you to lower your guard and then to raise it up, hit you where your weak is. So in order to not get hit to that. In order to not get hit by this, you would have to drop into a hanging guard to get your strong into the path of the attack as quickly as possible. And if people are adamant about using upright guards,
you're cutting out, David.
Yeah, you're cutting out right now for the past 10-15 seconds or so, something.
Okay. Yeah, so it's following a curved path, and if you're in an upright stance, and you're getting baited down and then try to catch up to the blade with raising your sword normally, chances are pretty high that you get hit in the weak. And what you need to do, or what you would need to do, is basically turn the thing around to bring the strong of your sword as quickly as possible into the path of the attack. That's the basic idea of the Schlenker attacks. It's the attempt of feinting and attacking.
So one thing I was wondering is there's one line where it's like do this really weird curve, and it was like, how do I even turn my wrist like that? How do you even cut like it? This looks impossible. I think it's a W line if I'm correct, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, let me check real quick. The W line. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I don't think that I have a useful answer to that. Not right now.
Just break your wrists. Easy.
Yeah, like Chrisman spends a lot of time insisting on you training your wrist properly.
Okay. Okay, so Christmann has like a dozen different attacks or actions on the blade. Can you maybe talk more about that? Because it's like you have almost this laundry list of techniques that you can do on the blade, and it's like, what do you even do with all of this? This is crazy.
Yeah. So he. This is thrust fencing. That's the short answer is this is thrust fencing. There's two blades in the middle. They meet. You have to get creative to displace the opponent's blade to be able to attack them. And a lot of these actions he describes come from thrust fencing and basically have thrust fencing considerations built into that. Chrisman, being very pedantic, decides to separate like different kinds of beats from each other. So for him, a forcé and a ramassement are both something that if you work with like less resolution, you both are beats, but Chrisman insists on coming up with stuff that differentiates all of these different blade actions from each other. I don't know by heart what the differences are, but I know that he has these ideas. I think forcé is when you do it in either during a parry or with the motion that you would use as a parry, and a ramassement is thrown with a motion that is from one of the attacks. I think that's the difference between forcé and a ramassement, but I'm not entirely sure. And this is something that I like and I just go, what the fuck am I going to do with all of this? This is one of the critiques that I have towards Christmann, because he doesn't actually tell us. He doesn't like, he gives us a lot of techniques and he gives us a lot of very detailed instruction on how to perform these techniques, but tactical consideration, strategic consideration, why should we use what technique in what context, he doesn't tell us. And the Italian stuff that I also, like the Italian sabre fencing that I also picked up a little bit later, is way more advanced when it comes to this. Basically, to look for certain types of fencing actions that your opponent performs and telling you that what fencing action you should perform against that and why you should perform that. And this is something that that is a little bit lacking in Christmann, and that's one of the very valid critiques for his style of teaching. But yeah, maybe to soften that blow, it's important to note that the stuff in the front section of Christmann is supposed to.
Are you cutting out?
Yep.
Maybe you can repeat the last 10 to 15 seconds or so.
Yeah, the important part to keep in mind is that the front part, the front section, the dual fencing section, even if Sebastian is going to kill me for that, it's meant to be for people who already know how to fence, and for people who don't need to be taught why you would do a certain blade action, because you've already had like 10 years of foil fencing, and he just comes along and says, this is how you do it with the saber, have fun with it. And
I see.
yeah, it doesn't make it a more useful source for HEMA today, but it maybe explains why something this important, which is an absolute no-brainer really, hasn't found its way into Chrisman.
Okay, and then another technical question is, he has these Scheinangriffe and coup de maître. Is it like a attack into second intention or something like that? Because I had little trouble understanding what this does basically.
So his coup de maître are pretty interesting because they are basically the meaner versions of other techniques he shows. So basically, there are certain combinations that you learn during his during normal, like for example, you do a blade action against the hand, and normally he advises you to go to the body or to the head in the normal instruction. Hello.
Okay, it's normal again.
Okay, and in the coup de maître, he goes for different targets. He goes for the arm immediately or something like that. The coup de maître are not something that I would consider, I don't know, secret knowledge that people fencing other sources than Chrisman should like download into their brains so they become masters themselves. But it's like tweaks to techniques you have already learned when you go deep into Chrisman itself.
Okay.
I don't think that it's something that's super useful for people following other sources.
Okay, that's in all questions from my side.
Okay, Russ has another one for me.
Okay, we are starting to get enough signal degradation and we've gone for a bit. So I would like to open the floor to final questions for this interview. And then as is our tradition, we want to ask you for what's your elevator speech? What's your very short version of why somebody new to HEMA or new to saber fencing or new to cut and thrust single hand weapon fencing, so we don't get too pedantic there, why should they go after Chrisman? So first, before that, anybody have any final questions? All right, David, go.
Okay, so Chrisman gives you 2 parries and you can fence with 2 parries. That's all you need. And if you want to go beyond these 2 very simple parries that can basically allow you to fence within like 1 session, it has like almost infinite depth. You can fence Chrisman for the rest of your life if you're not super young. So it's a little bit rough in the middle, but it's really good to pick up and it's really deep in the end. And if that's something that you might be interested in, Chrisman might be just the thing for you.
Wow, good elevator speech. Okay, anybody else? Any final observations? All right, well, this is David Schmitz telling us all about FC Chrisman. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for spending a couple hours out of your Sunday to talk to us about this. I will collate the sources you have given me and make sure they're put online in the description. And if I'm fortunate, I will have this up probably by next Friday.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Can I just say how glad I am to have this like workshop of people just being able to talk about different super stuff.
It's super cool.
I would not have went quite as far, quite as quick as I would have into French sabre without other people to challenge me in my ideas, like you guys.
Yeah, we tend to be in our own little silos, and anything we can do to get out of those is a very good thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and in like the Discord is one of the very few places that have like the ability to get us out of there, right?
It's about the only place where I really felt like I could get a good live criticism, especially because people can talk to you live on Discord. So you get it's not like a Facebook comment section where it kind of gets lost. It kind of gets lost, and you can't really have a proper developed conversation. Whereas I feel like in Discord, we can kind of have a proper back and forth, and that's
yeah, and I think it's less touristy. The Discord is like, if you're in, you're in, and if you're out, you're out, and people are in it long term.
Yeah.
And with Facebook, I feel like it's a little bit of like random shit flinging for me.
Right. Like I felt very much like my experience last year in the Discord was pretty much that, where I got exposed to a bunch of stuff, but people also were very cordial about telling me stuff like, hey, what you do is that, but I do this, and it works differently, so hear me out. And pretty much, yeah, now I'm like on an infinite journey through HEMA Sabre and trying to read everything and practice everything at once. It doesn't work.
Yeah. No. It's endlessly entertaining. That's how you say it.
Oh, obviously.
All right. I need to go ahead and shut this down. Thank you all, and catch you all again for the next episode soon. Thanks again, David.
See ya.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We've got more videos and content coming, so if you liked what you saw and it was useful for you, please stab the like button, /subscribe, and punch the little bell icon so that you're notified immediately when new content comes available. Thanks, and go do the thing.